Hello everyone. My presentation is on saturated fat versus unsaturated fat. Now we all know how important physical activity is for optimal health, but it's also equally important to know the type of food that you eat. Most food that you eat contains fat in it. Now, what do we know about fat? What comes to mind when you hear the word fat? Fat is almost synonymous with something negative. Overall, when someone says fat, oh, we're thinking about diabetes, heart disease. So, is it a true statement to say fat is bad for you? Well, before I answer that, let me explain. Our body needs fat. It is a potent source of energy. There's also some vitamins that can only be dissolved in fat. For example, vitamin A, D, E, and K. So not all fat are created equal. Knowing the facts about fat can mean the difference between being healthy and also having a elevated bad cholesterol. For this presentation, we're going to learn about the terms molecular structure of fat, hydrogenation, and trans fat. Now, the two most common familiar terms when it comes to fat is saturated fat and unsaturated fat. So that's where we should begin. Now, the molecular structure of fat, if you look, what you have basically is a head. It's called glycerol head. Glycerol is just another word for alcohol. And this head is attached to some fatty acid tails that looks just like this, that is made up of carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms. So what we have here is the head and the fatty acid tails. Now, looking closely, I have a diagram here of one of the fatty acid tail. Okay, so as you can see, we have the glycerol head up here, and you have a string of carbon atoms. Now, each carbon atom is attached to a hydrogen. Now, when atoms are bonded together, that means it's stable, right? So they have a strong bond. So it's not going to look for any other pair because it's bonded to something else, right? So this is just one of the string of fatty acid tail on the molecular structure of fat. Now, what's the difference between this diagram and this diagram, right? Now, if we look closely, this is an example of a saturated fat acid tail. Now, this down here is an example of unsaturated fat acid tail. And I'm going to explain. If you look here, each carbon is bonded to a hydrogen. Now, down here, we can see a carbon-carbon double bond. And you can see it's not attached to a hydrogen. No hydrogen here, no hydrogen here. And that causes what we call a kink in the structure. And that kink causes an unstable and weaker bond. And we all know that what determines the type of fat depends on the arrangement of carbon and hydrogen atoms. The molecular shape gives unique characteristic to the type of fat. Okay. Now, if you look here, we can see it's saturated with hydrogen. Now, down here, you can see we're missing some hydrogen, right? So, hence the word saturated. So when you hear the word saturated, they're talking about it's saturated with hydrogen. So that's saturated fat, and over here we have less hydrogen, therefore it's unsaturated. So that's where the term saturated and saturated fat came from. So just a review, a saturated fat has a denser bond of hydrogen, and an unsaturated fat has a double carbon-carbon double bond. And I know you heard of monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. Now, we know that the word mono means one, and then a poly means more than one, right? So if you look here, this is an example of a saturated molecular structure, saturated fat. Now, if I would draw the unsaturated molecular structure, it would look like this. Basically, you have the head, then you have the tail, but that tail would have a kink. And that is where the carbon double bond is, right here. Now, if we're talking about a mono, that means it's only one kink, and then you have two saturated fatty acid tail, so it would look like that. That's a mono unsaturated. Now, if we're talking about a polyunsaturated, then it would look more like this. You have the glycerol head, glycerol is just another word for alcohol, and then you have the fatty acid tail, but instead of one kink, you'll have one right here, and maybe it would look like this. So you have two kinks. So if you're reading about fat literature, it's common to see this right here. That just means polyunsaturated. Okay. So when you read a food label, make sure you check saturated versus unsaturated fat. Now, from here we're going to move along, and we're going to talk about the process of hydrogenation. Now, when you go to the market, you see when you pick up a tub of margarine or butter, and you'll see hydrogenated. Now, what does hydrogenated mean? Okay, hydrogenated is a process where they synthetically take unsaturated fat and turns into a saturated fat. Now, for what reason? Food companies started doing that to preserve the food longer and to change the texture of their food. So basically, what they're doing during the hydrogenation process is they take the unsaturated fat and they saturate it with hydrogen. They bombard it with hydrogen, basically, and turns into saturated fat. The reason for that is to preserve it, of course, and to change the texture. That's one of the reasons. Unfortunately, it yields a product called trans fat. So in the process of hydrogenation, what we get is trans fat. Now, trans fat acts just like saturated fat. Okay, so you have to be careful. And saturated fat is known to cause to clog arteries, right? Because if you look here, saturated fat, the bond is stronger, it's hard to break. Unsaturated fat, it's a weaker, unstable bond, so basically your body can break it down. Okay? So, now that you know about some of the facts about fat, eat smart and eat well. And remember that a diet that's low in saturated fat can lower your risk of heart disease, and other heart problems. Thank you. So I hope you learned something.